Hi, it's Mark, and in this podcast, I want to talk to you about technique and what we call the compositor's mindset, which could just be synonymous with the artist's mindset. Now, you might be thinking, what's the point of listening to this guy talk to me about technique? It's a valid question. Technique is doing, not talking, but specifically what we're going to focus on here is approach, how you approach a visual problem. Motion graphics isn't always about solving a problem. Sometimes it's about just following your bliss and making discoveries along the way. It's not even necessarily about expert technique. Sometimes super crude and hacky things make for the best art. I think there's a limit to how much you can really thrive without technical acumen, but there is a lot of room for pure experimentation and happy accidents in any art form, no matter how technical. Some artists find the techniques they're the most comfortable relying on, and they just kind of stick with those. And some of them are very good artists. But I'm going to get really specific and say that all artists are sometimes guilty of what I'm going to call failing to see. So I'll talk about myself here for a second. I managed to ascend to a leadership position in the art department at LucasArts, which was the interactive division of Lucasfilm, without actually knowing how to draw. I didn't really know how to design either, but back then in the 90s, not anybody really knew how to teach that. But I did find a course on learning to draw. So I ended up taking a full week away from my second job, which was as a creative director at an interactive agency called Fluid, to take a course entitled Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And this was out at one of the most beautiful places on earth, Esalen. If you haven't heard of it, it is a very famous spot on the remote Central California coast, and it is an incredible power spot. Now, the course was taught by an associate of a woman named Betty Edwards, who wrote a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. Her basic thesis is that our minds think we know what we see. Specifically, she divided the brain into the analytical left side of the brain and the creative associative right side of the brain. And her theory and the thesis of the book is that when we draw poorly, it's a failure to see what is right in front of us. And by right, I mean on the right side of the brain, and instead using our idea from the left side of the brain of what the thing looks like. So in other words, the natural world is right there in front of us, but we're always interpreting it. And sometimes we're doing that in ways that really are not at all faithful to the thing itself. So I spent the week, drawing still life scenes from nature, portrait subjects, and this was my playground to learn about detail, proportion, shading, everything that goes into good pencil drawings. I learned to look critically at how well I was able to represent what I saw. And I was really lucky to have a week to just learn this in such a beautiful, bucolic, and energized setting, because the actual energetic load on my mind was pretty intense. I was literally building neurology to help me see as an artist. But once I had done it, it was a skill that I possessed, kind of like riding a bicycle. Now, a few years later, I had my first set of experiences creating visual effects for a Hollywood feature film. And those experiences occurred first at a place called The Orphanage, which was the tongue-in-cheek name of the first visual effects spin-off from Industrial Light and Magic, and specifically what was called the Rebel Division at ILM, which were guys working on Macintoshes to create shots for movies like Star Wars. And these were my friends, and three of them founded this company, and I knew them from our time together working for George. So each time I would go into the orphanage and start on a new feature as a freelancer, dailies for the first few days were almost kind of brutal. Here I was in a room full of people who were some of the most highly attuned in the world at critiquing shots. I mean, some of these guys, Dennis Murin at ILM was actually notorious for only needing to see your shot one time, even if it was only 24 frames long, and he could give you a full breakdown of everything that needed work in the shot. And some of these people were practically that good. We would loop the shots, but not very many times. Now, this would all happen in dailies, and when we got under real crunch, we'd also have nightlies. So dailies was the way you would start the day. Get your coffee and something humane like 9:30. Maybe that sounds humane to you. In the morning, we would sit on a leather couch and look at each other's shots, and mostly the supervisor would critique, but anybody was free to throw in anything they saw. So one was held to a very high standard from day one. And so the feeling going in there was really almost like, oh my God, here we go again. My brain is being rewired, kind of like that drawing experience. It was as if I was getting more intelligent by being around all these intensely gifted and intelligent artists. And it was kind of exhausting because it was a growth process. So definitely not a vacation, but I did thrive on it. Now, based largely on that experience, I started writing books on visual effects and After Effects. And when the time came for this podcast, I thought to dig out an old copy of the book where I wrote this in the introduction in a section called Artistry. This is what I want to focus on. Artistry. When I was working on the first edition of this book, I used to ride my bicycle home up the steep hill out of the Presidio where the orphanage was located and think about what people really needed to know in order to move their work to the level of a visual effects pro. Here's what I came up with, and there are 4 points listed. One is get reference. The next is simplify. Then there's break it down. And finally, don't expect a perfect result on the first try. So again, those are get reference, simplify, break it down, and don't expect a perfect result on the first try. Now, those probably sound somewhat familiar, but let me dig in a little bit and talk about this in the context of visual effects. I'll go one by one. So get reference. You can't recreate what you can't clearly see. This is what I learned in that drawing class. And too many of us skip this step, even if we know better. And I'm including myself. So back in the day, we at least had the excuse that it was challenging to find reference. There was no Google Images. Actually, a little tip, I like to use Bing rather than Google. I find the searches return better results, and you don't have these restrictions on directly downloading stuff. And, Bing is number 2 by a long distance, so they try harder, perhaps. Anyway, that's enough of a plug for Microsoft. But reference is now literally a click or two away, whether it's still or moving image reference. Moving images would be, YouTube probably. And anytime you go look at reference, if something's telling you, I should take a look at some reference on this, there's always at least one surprise in there if you're looking closely enough. So, for example, fire and smoke. What does that look like? And now you've got an image in your head of what fire and smoke looks like. And some things about that image in your head are completely correct. And there's even some detail and some motion potentially, depending on how your visualization abilities are. But you've only thought of maybe one context, and it probably refers to one or a set of experiences that are pretty similar. And you're not able to account for the thousands of different fires that are out there in the world. Now, why bother doing this whole get reference routine with motion graphics, you might ask? Because you might be of a mind that you're trying to come up with something completely original. You want to break the rules. You want to turn things inside out. You want to make the world look different than it does. So actually, I'm going to save my comments for that until the end and move on. So the next point is simplify. And I'm going to paraphrase Einstein here. A good solution is as simple as possible, but no simpler, right? So in a sense, you could say that's genius. Genius is the ability to simplify a problem down as much as possible, but if you go too far, then you've oversimplified it, and what you've come up with is frankly idiotic. So I mean, I'm not sure that, do I need to say more here? I don't know, but I would add that I even have the habit, in my own case, of tearing down and rebuilding work that is more or less completed if I see a better approach, particularly if I'm going to hand this off or if there's any possibility that my more convoluted approach is going to come back and bite me. Because usually, as you know, if you've ever failed to save and then had to redo something, the redoing can go rather quickly once you know the path to the solution. Now, for me, simplification has not only to do with the result you see on screen and how my project is organized and looks, but my own workflow. So you'll find I'm a huge proponent of knowing your keyboard shortcuts, of which After Effects has more than certainly any Adobe application and possibly more than just about any application out there. Many of these shortcuts tend to be listed in menus, so if you're still using menus, just get in the habit of making yourself learn that shortcut. And I mean, you don't have to listen to me, but that's my advice. In context menus are a set of commands that I use all the time. Just right click on an area of the UI if you don't know where all these are, and you'll discover them. And that will speed up and simplify your workflow just in terms of how many clicks it takes to do a thing. And that actually improves your work because you're energized by that. Now, maybe you've also noticed that the software itself, and I'm not just talking about After Effects, although what I'm about to say will sound like I'm talking about After Effects. The software tends to get buggier as you get into more convoluted workarounds in your project. So if you've built a sort of chewing gum and baling wire solution to a thing, and some of the chewing gum gets loose and you could have welded it, well, that metaphor was a little on the nose, but regardless, I have noticed for sure that if I'm crashing, I mean, back in the day, early on when I was learning Cinema 4D, it would crash on me. And I talked to a pretty experienced artist and he said, yeah, I bet you're doing some stuff where you kind of reach in for solutions. Actually, I hate to admit, but I think he was right. So an experienced artist eliminates these rat holes that can turn into rat traps, if you will. All right. The next one, break it down. You know, if even the most complicated shot consists of small, comprehensible steps, you know, there might be thousands of them, but if that's true, then any visual problem can be solved by patiently just being reduced to the point where it's simply a question of performing those steps in the correct order. Reminds me of the earliest days of the automobile where people would get a guy, it's usually a guy, maybe some women did too, but a guy would get started as a mechanic by taking apart a car and then disciplining himself to put it back together without any spare parts lying on the ground. Now, this is easier said than done in many cases, certainly, but there's still a huge difference between what's difficult and what's actually impossible. And, you know, part of the fun here with visual effects is in actually performing the seemingly impossible. So seemingly is the key word there. That just means it's merely difficult and you haven't given enough space around breaking it down. Now, this one applies, and when I say this one, I mean break it down. This applies as much, if not more, to planning and supervising a shoot or any other creation and selection of elements than it does actually working in After Effects. So I remember an example years ago. I taught for a time at Academy of Art in San Francisco, and I remember a student wanting to know how he could create the effect of someone levitating high in a chair suspended in the air. So he literally wanted to know, how am I going to get my talent in a chair suspended 30 or 40 feet off the ground? Or how am I going to shoot them on the ground and put that up in the sky? And I was only thinking about, how are you going to get the right angle that's going to match regardless of the distance, which is a completely different problem to solve. So if you're trying to solve the wrong problem in that case, if he had shot it on the floor, that never would have worked. And had he shot it with the poor talent somehow suspended on some rig, I shudder to think what might have happened. Now, this can lead to some pretty creative results, like, hey, I know this place that's got a glass floor. Maybe, as I say this, I'm like, oh God, the lighting would be a nightmare. But, you just let yourself kind of sit with it once you've understood, well, the issue is that we have to be at this angle more than that we have to be at this distance. Trivial example. And hopefully you can put aside how maybe easily you could solve that one and just think about what it means about how to look at any given problem. Because we've all got ones that'll, stump one of us and then be like easy peasy for somebody else. And it happens all the time on set that people are thinking literally about a problem rather than thinking about what's this going to be like in post-production. I'll give you another example. I was supervising a shoot late last year, and we had to do a virtual building construction because it was an advertisement for this multi-million-dollar condo overlooking the bay that they hadn't built yet. And they wanted to show a couple hanging out in their beautiful pad, which they were going to create completely virtually after the shoot. So one of the shots they wanted was this woman. She's out on her deck over the bay painting, and she's leaning against, or she's sort of in front of and leaning against the window. And all this thought went into, well, how are we going to get that reflection? Should we bring in some glass? Do we need a mirror? And I said, all we need to do is move the camera over the same number of degrees to the opposite side, and there's your mirror image. And they said, well, can't we just flop the shot over right there? And no, that wouldn't work unless that mirror or the glass wall was exactly perpendicular to the camera, which then you wouldn't see it. So no, that wouldn't work. So that one I didn't have to really think about because experience told me, because I'd failed to do a bunch of shadows and reflections. So I'd learned that one the hard way. But had I not done that, then it's possible that even just having someone sit in front of an actual window would tell me what I needed to know. Let's move on to the final point here. So the final one is, don't expect a perfect result on the first try. Wise words, yes? So I had a colleague at LucasArts who moved on to the art department at Pixar, and he liked to say that recognizing flaws in your own work doesn't mean you're a bad artist. It only means you have taste. And I love that. Now, maybe this is because I had the challenge of being raised in a family where the mindset about success, ability, talent tended to be a bit fixed. But I can't emphasize this enough. The universe is a highly intelligent place, and when you find flaws in your own work, one could say that you're just tapping into that universal intelligence, and it's an opportunity to grow and learn something. It certainly can be difficult to see it that way when you're under pressure, but try to be kind to yourself and remember that it's much easier for somebody later on watching your movie to pick it apart than it is for you to do it while you're making the thing. And movie, I'm using the term loosely. It's whatever you're making. Crowds rarely are wrong, but that's not necessarily helpful. Creativity, frankly, is not a competition. So sometimes there are appearances to the contrary, but really you can treat the whole thing as a learning experience and an opportunity to find out something you didn't know. And think about it. I mean, somebody who has the confidence to not know is generally somebody you're really going to respect. If they're your supervisor, your boss, your colleague, if they're willing to say, wow, I don't really know what that looks like, or I tried this and it didn't work, and I'm looking for a suggestion. A lot of people can't do that. And if you can't do that, okay. But, I mean, it's great if you can, but you can also at least give yourself a break and walk away and regather yourself and admit that what you're doing isn't working. Try something else. Now, if all this stuff about universal intelligence is sounding a little woo-woo, I do want to reinforce all of these points are basically how things work at the best studios in the world. Matte painters with the abilities that would rival Da Vinci go get reference, as did Da Vinci, by the way. Look at his sketches of motion and anatomy. So the artist that gets rehired is someone who leaves behind, and that means for others to work on a project that someone else can open up and work with and understand. And ideally, it also renders efficiently. That's the simplicity point. The number one job, if you're a supervisor, is to notice things that would benefit from being further broken down or noticing specifics that could use attention, and in advising how to do that. And there's virtually no shot in the world of visual effects land that is approved on the first take. It just doesn't happen. I know that in MoGraph, it would be a little horrifying, right? Because in VFX, it's not uncommon to have a shot with you for a week or two, if it's a hard one. So you're working on the same shot for 2 weeks and you're potentially, nobody thinks you're doing a bad job if you're going into the low double digit. If you're going to the high double digit, your take's probably in trouble, but low double digits is not an alarm bell necessarily for a given take if it's a hard one. So any experienced artist can share also the experience of having to bail, having to completely start over. So maybe you did get to take 13 and you realize this whole approach is not working. Great. That can be just fine. And I said I was going to loop back to reference as it applies to motion graphics. So some of you are going to take this course and you're going to want to actually go do visual effects compositing. And I consider this art to be, again, you've probably heard me say before, it's making a shot appear to have been taken with a single camera when it was not, whatever that means to you. So what you're doing, what your job is, it's suspension of disbelief for the viewer. They want you to fool them, just like a magician would, into, even if they know there's no freaking way that was shot with a camera. And sadly, sometimes great stunt work or practical effects work, which is when they blow stuff up right on set, gets overlooked because people just assume it has to be fake. Anyway, but I'm not going to shed too many tears for that because that's not really what it's all about. And not to get sidetracked by that, let's talk about motion graphics. So I'm going to tell another story. I had the opportunity to be a VFX supervisor. I was flown down to LA to supervise on a Chris Cornell video. Chris Cornell is the late, great lead singer of Soundgarden. And this was one of his solo projects. And yes, I got to meet him. But they had a very low budget. And the main thing they were asking me to do was actually mocap, which was way, way, way not in their budget. But I ended up just supervising the show. And they had Chris in a car at the beginning. And horrifyingly to me, they wanted the car to be driving around at night. And the post-production company took that and just stuck a bunch of Gaussian blurs on the background and called it done. And here's an opportunity to make all this beautiful bokeh blur. We already touched on that in lesson 0, actually, and we'll probably get into it a bit more. But yeah, anyway, the VFX artist in me shed a small tear that I didn't hit them over the head with what a night shot with lights should look like. I mean, fair enough. Maybe they wanted to do it that way, and that's kind of really getting to my point here. A motion graphics artist can certainly justifiably say, I don't care about reference. I want it to look like this. In fact, a visual effects artist is often called to do that as well. But, and I have one more story about that, but in this case, I would really strongly argue they took a much less interesting path and missed an opportunity. So it's subjective, but I think it basically came from ignorance and just failing to see the beautiful world, in this case of optics. So that final story, it's not one that I have firsthand, but it was pretty famous. I was working still for Lucasfilm during the time of Star Wars Episode 1, George Lucas's return to directing. And he had access to the best people, including John Knoll, who more recently has run ILM. And John was in charge of the what the hell are they called? The pod race, right? And I've tried to kind of suppress that movie in some ways. But anyway, so these, George wanted these things to look like they're going super fast. Like, he comes from the world of car racing. So he just wanted them faster and faster. And John at some point said, well, that's impossible. I mean, if it were actually going across the shot as fast as you want it, it would be going the equivalent of, and he put some totally impossible speed, like 5,000 miles an hour or something. And George said, I don't care. That's how it should look. And luckily, John Knoll is not a guy who has to worry about, I'm going to say, a gaffe like that, even though, God, I really should not be calling someone like John Knoll out on anything. But take it to heart that you should be mindful of ever protesting, that's not how it works. So there's two sides to it, right? There's what's accurate and there's what you know from getting reference. And then even in visual effects, there is pushing it into where it's going to have the emotional impact that you want. But sometimes the reference is going to help you get there. So that is all how it's done at the best studios in the world. And if you're not currently working at one of them, I would suggest this is how you should do it too, so that one day you will. Peace out, and we'll be riffing on this theme throughout the course.